After a nearly 2-year legal battle, pharmaceutical giant Johnson & Johnson and 3 major drug distributors have reached a $26 billion settlement with various states. The settlement, quote, lays the framework for billions of dollars to begin flowing into communities across the country for addiction treatment, prevention services, and other steep expenses from the opioid epidemic.
Now, in exchange, the states receiving money will not bring any future action against the groups. But many say this agreement doesn't go far enough. Here to weigh in is founder of thefix.com and program director of the Heavenly Center, Joe Schrank. Joe, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So break down this agreement for us. Why do you think this is a raw deal for the victims of these companies?
Well, it sounds like a lot of money. It's actually not, right? So $26 billion over 18 years is really kind of a slap on the wrist for these pharmaceutical companies that make massive, incredible amounts of money. So there is a byproduct to the products that they deliver and how they amass wealth. It's actually a slap in the face of every grieving family that's lost somebody to an overdose. We're in a fever pitch of overdose. We've had 90,000 overdose deaths in 2020. That's the highest on record. This isn't really going anywhere. And so 26 billion sounds like a tremendous amount of money to the average person, and it is, but spread out over 18 states, it doesn't really even cover the additional cost in foster care because so many people have overdosed and left their kids in that system.
I mean, how far or how long do you think this $26 billion will even go? Like, give us kind of an idea.
I mean, look, it depends what you do with it, right? So, treatment can be expensive. It is significantly less than incarceration. So it's very much time for America to shift to a public health policy rather than any kind of jurisprudence or any kind of incarceration. We're never going to get anywhere with that. So it depends. The D.A.R.E. program has been around for a very long time. It's listed as one of the most ineffective programs in the history of drug prevention, and it's very expensive. So it depends what happens with the money, who gets the money. Are they going to use it for services? Are they going to use it for medication assistance? Are they going to use it for mutual aid therapies? Those kinds of things. But I think it offers a chance to have a larger question about drug policy in general, because we don't do a very good job of it. If we did, we wouldn't have the body count that we do. And there are ways to integrate it into the health system so that we do have better outcomes.
I'm really glad you criticized the D.A.R.E. program. I remember going through that in middle school.
Well, if you're young enough for the D.A.R.E. program, it's a ridiculous institution and it should be eradicated.
It makes their programming makes no difference between like marijuana and heroin. It's like all drugs equally bad. Avoid them. You'll be addicted. You're going to turn into anyway.
A murderous, right? Yeah, it doesn't. Right.
That kind of zero tolerance scaremongering obviously fails, and certainly, we need a more humane approach, and we need to, treat this not as a criminal issue but a medical issue. But turning back to the role these companies play, what would you like to see them do or be forced to do instead of, striking this agreement where they give this amount of money?
Well, I think that if it's a finite thing, right? So $26 billion can be spent in a government agency over all those states very, very quickly. I think it needs to be something sustainable and long term. So a dollar fee per prescription that's funneled into recovery services. I actually think the alcohol industry should be held accountable to that too. And I actually think that people are open to it as there's legalization for cannabis. But the truth is it should be like car insurance. Insuring a Ferrari is more expensive than insuring a Buick. So OxyContin and those kinds of substances should have to pay a higher premium for the damage that they cause than cannabis. So I think it's a matter of creating an economy and creating something sustainable, because the need's not going to go away. This is not a one-time 2-year, suddenly we don't have an OxyContin or pill problem or people switching to heroin. That is not the case here. This is a long day's journey into night to stop this locomotive and to shift it back in the other direction.
Yeah, we have a giant problem with this. And so are they doing anything other than just, okay, here's throwing money at the problem? Here's a little bit of money. I mean, what else are they doing to try to curb the actual epidemic?
Well, it doesn't seem like they're trying to do much. One of the things that is effective is to offer people cannabis on the front end to manage chronic pain and other symptoms, right? So in other words, don't start with the most egregious substance, start with the least invasive and least harmful substance. There are lots of people who have found success in managing chronic pain with cannabis, my 80-year-old mother being one of them. She doesn't bring a bong to Bridge. She's not a crazy drug addict, but she has had a lot of success in managing arthritis pain with cannabis. Doctors and large systems like the VA should introduce that idea before opening the opiate can of worms. So there are lots and lots of ways that we can do a better job with this. Through the pandemic, and we've seen a massive spike in substance misuse, the death rate for cannabis has held steady at 0. So one of the things that we should be doing is encouraging people to use the least harmful, least risky substance as opposed to the most harmful, most risky substance. That actually makes absolutely no sense from a scientific perspective. From my discipline as a clinical social worker, it doesn't make any sense to advise that. It certainly doesn't make sense from a medical perspective. So what are we actually doing about this, to shift people? Sorry about that. I'm getting a little excited here. So what are we actually doing? What are we actually doing about this to change the foundation and the culture to have a different outcome? $26 billion. It's nice. It's a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
Yeah, no, the prospect of cannabis decriminalization and also as a therapeutic is exciting because, we don't want to be, that's the issue with the opioid epidemic. We don't want to be denying people, there's addiction and there's death and it's terrible. At the same time, we don't want to be denying sick people who are suffering, who are in a lot of pain from medicine that eases their pain, that's also abusive. So if there are alternatives we can start with and maybe not go straight to opioids that actually work for those people, it's a no-brainer to take that option. And only this weird hang-up the government and certain people in society have had about cannabis is thankfully going away and should go away a lot more rapidly.
It's not. It is and it isn't, right? There are still people who are incarcerated for small personal use amounts. The conservative America, which I don't understand, is still pushing back on it based on morality, when in fact, if they're so opposed to the nanny state, why is the government making a decision about your health care or what an individual ingests? And if they're looking for fiscal responsibility, there is nothing bigger or more wasteful than the drug war.
But isn't this a case where, no, I agree with you completely, but even I feel like Democratic administrations have not gone nearly far enough with this, given the popularity among their own base for decriminalization, drug legalization, et cetera. And you don't see enough of that coming out of Biden and Obama before him.
Without question. And I had this conversation with the Biden or with the Obama administration, and they were like, okay, thanks. But basically they were like, the first black guy who's a president can't start talking about legalizing cannabis. Joe Biden, and let's just get out the brass tacks, he's too old. He doesn't get it. He's from a different generation. They fired 5 staffers for testing positive for THC when the rest of the staff is getting drunk in Georgetown after work. It makes absolutely no sense. And yes, the Biden administration and liberal America is also culpable. There has always been de facto decriminalized drug use for white people. So if you're puttering around in your Prius sipping a latte with a bag of weed in your car, you're pretty safe from the cops. If you're a young black kid, you're not. So that's sort of the thing that we have to mend for sure. And I agree. I totally agree wholeheartedly. Liberal blue state America is as culpable, but they are more open to change than red state America. So this becomes a cultural, this becomes a culture war issue. Unfortunately, if it were based in science and logic, cannabis would be readily available and alcohol would be harder to get.
Joe, I have one final question for you. Are we seeing any good news at all as far as the addiction rates? Are we seeing them go down, or are they just steadily climbing?
They're steadily climbing. They've steadily climbed throughout the pandemic. All of the data is concerning, to say the least. One of the most concerning things is that the $50 billion a year rehab industry is basically AA indoctrination camp. And it doesn't really do much for people, to be honest. It's a 3 to 5% success rate. I tell people your chances of success in this kind of treatment are less than getting into Harvard or Stanford. So just to sort of put that into context for you, most of us aren't going to get into Harvard or Stanford, right? And so you have less of a chance of being totally abstinent from all drug use in perpetuity by going to a traditional rehab. At the Heavenly Center, we're trying to give people more options. We're trying to be more realistic about this. We're trying to have this steeped in science and logic rather than in morality and rather than an evangelical 12-step approach. With that said, I'm an AA guy, so it's a very difficult thing. It's a very difficult thing to find it. What I think is that recovery is deeply, deeply personal, and everybody kind of has to find their own relationship with it. Yeah. But if we're only giving one option, and you guys are too young, but we gave one option to manage HIV, which was abstinence. And all it did was breed disease. Until we started being logical about it and harm reduction and condoms and clean needles, we did not get a handle on the HIV crisis. And it will be similar with the opioid crisis. So if we don't start giving people other options other than go to AA like your aunt, we're not going to get very far.
Yeah. The very, very interesting points. Thank you so much for sharing this with us, Joe. It was great having you.
Thanks very much. Take care.
Thanks, Joe.
Stick with us. We'll be back with more Rising next.